Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another random review. Today's random review is Sergei Bondarchuk's War and Peace from 1966 and 1967. Holy moly. I was going to do this all in one part, but I haven't actually watched parts 2, 3 and 4. I'm shooting the beginning of this on part 1 because I don't want to forget anything about part 1 by the time I watch part 2, 3 and 4, because it is 7 hours long. The first part's 2.5 hours, so that's the longest part. This is the Criterion Region A Blu-ray. It looks amazing. So on the basis of the first part, War and Peace might be the most beautiful film I've ever seen in my life. And that's saying quite a lot, because I've seen a few beautiful films. This is by number 983 on Criterion. It's a 2-disc. The second disc is still in my machine, because I have to watch parts 2 and 3. You do get a poster, and the essay is in the back of the poster. I am not a War and Peace aficionado. I have not read Tolstoy's novel. I have not seen the King Vidor, Audrey Hepburn, Henry Fonda version. I don't have any intention after watching part 1 of Bondarchuk's version. So I'll leave it to people who are smarter than me to compare the book with the films. I'm just going to talk about my experience with the film, and I'm going to start with part 1. Like I said, this is the longest part of the longest section of the 7-hour film. It's 2.5 hours, 147 minutes to be precise, and it's a flat out masterpiece. It's funny, this is Bondarchuk's second film, and it's somewhat epic. I'll get the things that kind of reminded me of and the things that perhaps influenced out of the way first. I think Kubrick must have seen this, because Barry Lyndon has certainly been influenced by this film. I mean, Barry Lyndon, the colours are a little more muted than War and Peace, and it's a little bit more painterly in the way it's shot. Also, characters in this film, we hear their internal monologue, which saves having invented characters there and just listening to how a character is feeling by spouting exposition. It works better just as these multiple voiceovers, which obviously Terrence Malick used in The Thin Red Line, so it kind of reminded me of that as well. The cinematography and lighting is just phenomenal, and when I say it reminds me of a Mario Bava film, you'll kind of get the idea. You know, sometimes these epics can be a little bit dry, and I think Bondarchuk probably realised this, so he decided to make it interesting with the colour palette, and the colour palette is just jaw-dropping. You will find yourself just pausing the film at times and just going, print that and stick it in an art gallery. Some of the shots are just ravishing. I mean, I know it's kind of lazy reviewing to go, this film is stunning, this film is sumptuous, but the sumptuosity of this film is just off the charts. The shots that literally will just make you wet yourself because they're just so stunning and so beautiful. If you take The Human Condition, which most of us recognise as being, one of the greatest films ever made, and I know lots of people argue it's the greatest film ever made, and that's a perfectly fair argument. So it's like, how do you make a 9-hour film that is compelling and engaging? The Human Condition's black and white, and yes, it has excellent cinematography, but for me, the real hook in The Human Condition is the character of Kaji, because you are hooked and you are compelled by that character, and you follow him on his journey, because he's not perfect, he has flaws, and you are riveted and you go on that journey with him. For me, at least, the first part, the characters aren't that compelling, and again, because of the voiceovers a lot of the time, you're perhaps a little bit distanced from them, and the story's not, that amazing or anything. We're following characters as they go into war, Austria and Russia against Napoleon in France, set in 1805. But what makes certainly the first part of this film, called Andrei Bolkonsky, because that's the main kind of character we follow as he goes into battle and wants to be a hero and prove himself, is this just visual smorgasbord. But within that epic, the battle scenes are just ridiculous. There's a just stunning moment where fog clears and then you see all these squares of the French army walking down a hill. It's just jaw-dropping. But it still has a really odd, quirky side to it. Again, that Bava-esque lighting, the use of greens and reds and yellows and blues. So there's always something going on. There's always something interesting in the frame, even though, a lot of it is, people dressed up sitting and having dinner and things like that. But it's still like riveting. There's a couple of really interesting scenes that kind of accentuate that. The character of Pierre, who comes into money, and he has a prospective wife that the family want him to marry, and they're in this little side room, and there's a water feature, and the water feature is just continually dripping throughout the scene, and it almost becomes the score of the scene. And you have family members who are desperately wanting to see whether, they're getting on or anything like that, and Bondarchuk naturally splits the frame using architecture. Obviously you could use split screen, but he uses architecture. So you hear the conversation of the couple, then you hear the conversation of the family members, and it's just wonderfully done. He uses dissolves and fades, he uses handheld, he uses quick axial cuts. So I think he knows the material could perhaps be a little dry, but he pulls out all the visual stops. So again, even if it is people having dinner, it's just done in a really compelling way with the production design and the lighting. There's another wonderful scene where Andrei's pregnant wife has been told to go to the country to live with his father as an ex-general, while he goes to fight in the war. So we're introduced by the general who's walking around his grounds, and the score is a string quartet. And as he rounds a corner, we actually see the string quartet playing in the woods. Obviously Woody Allen this was an inspiration for his film Love and Death in 1971, and Woody Allen has used that gag before of the music and then opening a cupboard and it's actually people playing music in the cupboard. Well, Bondarchuk does this straight because obviously this guy has paid people to come and play stringed instruments in his grounds, and that's the introduction to the character. So you have this epic film. This is only part one. I didn't want to watch it all in case I forgot things, so that's why I'm doing it in kind of parts, and then I'll probably lump it all together to one video, so apologies for the clunky nature of the video. So you have this epic, a kind of David Lean in parts, but it's shot like a Mario Bava film. It has these little idiosyncrasies to it. The internal monologues, the voiceovers are really wonderful. It's full of that Russian angst and metaphysics. Obviously more characters will be introduced in parts 2, 3 and 4, but part 1 is a straight up masterpiece. Again, it flies by for me anyway. At 2.5 hours, the positioning of the characters is just stunning. There's overhead shots that are mind-blowing. There's an overhead shot and the battlefield almost looks like the eye of a storm, and it looks like an eye and then the storm round it. Again, there is stunning compositions. You will use your pause button and just go stick that in an art gallery. Again, some of the tapestries, some of the artwork that are used in the houses and palaces in the film are stunning in themselves. It is pure art, but it's interesting. Obviously, Bondarchuk would do Waterloo later with Christopher Plummer and Rod Steiger, which you do feel there's maybe another half hour or an hour missing, but it just doesn't have, it's good, it's solid, but I don't think it would really hold up to repeated viewings, whereas I can't wait to watch part 1 again, because again, it's hard to describe. So it has that epicness, but it also has a weird atmosphere, a weird quirkiness, and it's just an amazing experience. And hopefully parts 2, 3 and 4 will be just as good. I think the longest remaining part's like 100 minutes, so hopefully I'll be watching it, the rest of it, quite quickly, and I'll be able to talk about 2, 3 and 4. But again, I just didn't want to watch the rest of it and maybe forget some things about part 1. Again, I'm not really going to go into plot that heavily. Obviously if you've read the book, you'll know the story, and again, it's basically about war and people in war. I think it pretty much follows 3 main characters, but it's more, this is cinema, so it's more about the visuals, and the visuals are just ridiculous, and the emotion you get from those visuals is just quite stunning. There's, the battle scenes and the aftermath of battles, there is a sense of desolation and confusion, and again, because he throws in different techniques cinematically. You know, it's not just a very static camera and very kind of there are surprises technique wise, and I can think that's what keeps it so entertaining, and that's what keeps you on the edge of your seat, and that's what keeps you engaged. Because certainly in part one the characters aren't, amazingly compelling, but to be honest it doesn't really matter, because what's going on the screen is just so ridiculously stupendous. So thanks very much for watching the start of the review of War and Peace for part 1, and hopefully I will be continuing with part 2, 3 and 4. Let's hope they don't nosedive terribly, but we'll see. A stunning start, that's all I'll say, a stunning start, and hopefully you'll join me for the rest of the review once I hopefully glue it all together with sticky back plastic and a couple of nails. So we will see you for part 2. So, part 2, 3 and 4 of Bondarchuk's War and Peace. In all the excitement talking about part 1, I completely forgot to mention that Bondarchuk is actually acting in the film as well. He plays Pierre. So now I've seen the whole film, I can talk a little bit about the Criterion release. It's a 2K restoration, and obviously Criterion have started doing 4K restorations. If they do a 4K restoration of War and Peace, they'll have to put out a safety warning with it, because people's eyes will probably pop out of their heads. Because like I said in part 1, which was perhaps slightly hyperbolic, but it is arguably one of the most beautiful films ever made. So this has a new interview with cinematographer Anatoly Petrisky. Obviously this was filmed over 3 years it took to film as a response to King Vidor's film, which is just a paltry 208 minutes, not the 422 minutes of Bondarchuk's film. And Bondarchuk went through 2 or 3 different cinematographers during the production. And there's an interview with Bondarchuk's son, Fedor. There's 2 documentaries from 1966 and 1969 about the making of the film. There's a television programme from 1967 on Ludmila Salieva, which features Sergei Bondarchuk, and she plays Natasha Rostova, which is the title of part 2. There's a new programme with Denise J. Youngblood, who wrote Bondarchuk's War and Peace, and really goes into in depth about the cultural and historic importance of this. I mean, this was the most expensive Russian film ever made, and probably still is. There's like ridiculous things. It was state backed, so they opened up 58 museums, so pretty much all the paintings and even the cutlery and plates and things like that are used in the film are out of museums to get it as authentic as possible. Like 25,000 costumes which were handmade. There was no expense spared, basically, just to one up the King Vidor film, which was popular in Russia, but it was more because of Audrey Hepburn rather than any historical accuracy or anything like that. And it also has the trailer, and as I said in part 1 of this review, you do get the essay, and it's spread over 2 discs. So if you've got a Region A player, this is like a must buy for me. So again, my review of part 2, 3 and 4 and the whole film in its 7-hour glory is not going to be a minute by minute summing up of the plot and character, because it is one of those films that, which is kind of odd to say for a 5-star film for me, is the fact that plot and character doesn't really matter that much. But so the second part is Natasha Rostova, which focuses on the female lead, the central character, and the three men who are vying for her affections. Andre from the first film, and Pierre, and this caddish officer who appears in the first part of the film as well. And then the third part is the year 1812, which focuses on a couple of battles before Napoleon's invasion of Moscow. And then the fourth and final part of the film is Pierre Bozaklov, played by Bondarchuk himself. And that is about the Russian retreat to Moscow, and then they leave Moscow deserted. Napoleon goes into Moscow. The fire in Moscow, he waits 5 weeks, and because of conditions and because there's no kind of treaty or official surrender, Napoleon eventually takes what's left of his troops, which are decimated, back to France. So again, this is not going to be plot heavy. So the second part, which is like 1805 to 1812, it ends pretty much with another ridiculous shot of Napoleon standing on a hill waiting to go into battle. Again, the look of the film, which I talked about in the first part of this review, is kind of like those paintings that we see of the Napoleonic Wars, and it's ridiculous. You will spend lots of time just pausing the film and just looking in awe on the image. Again, I don't know how people reacted when they actually saw this on a big screen. Their eyes must have just like popped out of their heads like they do in the Hanna-Barbera cartoons. So that speaks to the strength of the sheer visual opulence of the film, that the second part on paper is not really my thing. Again, it focuses on Natasha and the three men who are kind of vying for her affections. But because of the visual style, it's absolutely compelling. Even though, again, it's for me the least interesting part out of the four. There's our first grand ball that she goes to. We follow her up these almost endless stairs, and we see her reaction to the ball, and then we see the room, and we have the same reaction. It's literally jaw-dropping, the opulence. It just looks absolutely stunning. And she's kind of worried that nobody's going to dance with her, and we actually feel that emotion with her. You know, again, how this compares to the novel, it's not really what I'm interested in. Again, I'm a Philistine. I have never read War and Peace. I'm probably never going to read War and Peace. But I will be watching this film. I kind of want to watch it again immediately, and I've just watched it. So this is a film, because it's so visual, you could literally just watch it without the sound, without the subtitles, and you would know exactly what was going on. There is some Roger Corman in this part. There is Paul and Pressburger, and like I said, in the first part you can see Kubrick, you can see Bava. If you're a fan of visual cinema, and that sounds stupid because all cinema is visual, but visual filmmakers. It's funny because people say, Christopher Nolan is this visionary director, or Ridley Scott, and it's just like, please go away and watch War and Peace, because it is. I mean, if War and Peace was sugar, you would have like the Sugar Rush, because visually it is just so sumptuous. But it doesn't shy away from the brutality and the bleakness. Again, there is lots of references to nature. There's lots of kind of looking at what's going on from above and through clouds, the relationship between humans and animals, war and nature. Again, something Malick touched on, and Thin Red Line. So again, the second part is kind of quieter. There's perhaps not as much going on. It's still visually beautiful. Even in conversations, he does interesting things with the cameras. When you would expect close-ups, he does it in long shots. And then we get part 3, which focuses more on the battles. It's entitled The Year 1812. So this is when Napoleon starts to march across Russia. So you have a couple of battles where he's on about 7 miles or 7 kilometers away from Moscow. Again, the fact that quite high up in the credits there's a pyrotechnician, you kind of know what's coming. The battle scenes are ridiculous. Again, this ain't CGI. There's some matte work in the film, but this isn't CGI. This is literally a cast of thousands. But the thing that makes War and Peace probably my second favourite epic behind The Human Condition is the fact, yes, it has all the trappings of what we expect from epic cinema, but it still has the quirkiness of camera moves, swooping cameras. He turns the camera upside down at times, weird angles, interesting setups, because again, lots of epics can be stately and just very widescreen, not much happening with the actual camera, a kind of respectful, whereas Bondarchuk just does lots of interesting things with the camera, because again, trying to focus 3 characters through this tapestry of years, they do kind of cross paths and disappear out of the picture and back in. So for me, the characters aren't as important as just the sheer visual strength of the piece. Actually, my favourite character is probably the one-eyed general in charge of the Russian troops. Because for me there is a distance between the characters and emotional reaction, I tend to have more emotional reactions towards the shots, how amazing the film looks. But there are moments that almost catch you off guard as far as being emotional, and one of those involves the one-eyed general. So he's almost the most engaging character, because Andre, the military man, he's very cold and distant, and Pierre, played by Bondarchuk, he's coming out of his comfort zone of being rich and well off, and he goes into the, it's kind of ridiculous, but it also kind of works. He goes to the front line, but he's wearing this kind of white suit, a big white top hat, which would kind of make him a bit of a target. And he kind of sees the war as it really is. And that character, think that's why Bondarchuk wanted to play him, even though apparently all the Russian actors around at the time hated the fact that Bondarchuk played him because they were all dying to play that part, was so he could be the audience essentially, wandering about these ridiculous battle scene vistas with a bemused look in his face. Yeah, Bondarchuk, if you listen to in the supplements, he wasn't a popular guy. There was so many filmmakers that wanted to make War and Peace. He was a bit of a tyrant and a bit of a dictator. He didn't go on with the lead actor who played Andre. He wanted somebody else. He said a director should be God or a dictator on the set, and apparently that's what he was a bit. So people weren't a huge fan of him, certainly not putting himself in the film, going full Orson Welles and acting in the film and co-writing it, and also somehow directing it. The logistics are just mind-blowing. Again, it was the most expensive Russian film at the time, probably still is. There's 300 speaking parts in the film. The logistics are just ridiculous. So part 3 is about the impact of the battle, Napoleon getting closer to Moscow. Obviously we cut back to St. Petersburg, which is still the capital at the time, I believe. And the rich and the well-off just getting reports from the war, but not really being touched by it specifically. And then we get to part 4, which is called Pierre Bezukhov. And this is about the Russian army's retreat to Moscow, Napoleon arriving in Moscow, the fire of Moscow, which is one of the most amazing things you'll ever see in cinema. They pretty much built a replica of oldie worldy Moscow, and the DP laid tracks all round it. So when they set the whole thing on fire, again, this ain't CGI, this is real fire. They just had tracks so the camera could just go everywhere. And again, it's such an unusual epic for the reasons that I said before. It's not stately, this is it's dreamlike. Again, the narrative drive isn't the most important thing with the film. It's odd little touches about a soldier eating potatoes with this little dog. There's just little quirky things that just make it far more interesting for me than your average epic. The actor that plays Napoleon is way better than Rod Steiger in Bondarchuk's later Waterloo. He actually looks a lot more like Napoleon. He doesn't say a lot. The scenes where he is in this Moscow palace, again, it's just like pure eye candy. It's just ridiculous shot after ridiculous shot. But the scene where Moscow's on fire, the French army has come in, and Pierre has disguised himself as a peasant because he wants to kill Napoleon himself. And they're just running through, finding a child in a burning building, and obviously it's real flames. I mean, Bondarchuk, who put on extra weight to play Pierre, he almost killed himself just filming this. The logistics of the film are just off the charts. But the Moscow on fire sequence is just, there's ashes in the sky everywhere, because again, this is real fire burning real materials. It's just absolutely stunning. Again, it's a lazy, this review is not particularly analytical. This is more of just me rambling nonsensically. but it's easy to say, something is jaw-dropping, but this film truly is. It has arguably the most beautiful and horrible execution scene in cinema history. There's a bunch of prisoners. There's just a black kind of tree stump that they're getting lined up against, and there's a hole dug next to it, so when they get shot, they pretty much just rolled into the ditch. But it's in a cabbage field, so there's these rows of neat cabbages, which just kind of sets it off beautifully. The compositions that he uses are just sublime. Again, you can tell this isn't an epic made by a studio system, even though it's obviously the Russian studio system, but in the Hollywood sense, you can tell it's an epic not made by a committee. The script is written by two people, Bondarchuk and his collaborator. It's not a script written by half a dozen people. You can tell it's kind of the vision of one man who was probably a little bit unbalanced. And again, like I said, he was obviously influenced by the paintings that we see in museums of the Napoleonic Wars, because some of the shots look like those paintings. Like I say, you could actually put this film in an art gallery and just switch the sound off and just let it run all day long on a loop, because it belongs in an art gallery. And then in the end, like I said, there's some emotional beats that kind of take you by surprise. But in the end, for most of the film, for me, as far as the characters are concerned, it's maybe a little bit, I wasn't that emotional about it. I was emotional about the visuals, because they literally take your eyeballs and rub the eyeballs on the screen, and then put your eyeballs back in your sockets. But at the end of the film, I did find really powerful emotionally. And again, it's that a relationship with nature, a relationship in the universe. There's lots of wonderful Russian philosophy in the film. Again, that there is a narrator sometimes. There is those inner monologues of characters. It's an incredible film. Again, very much like The Human Condition. It kind of sat on my shelf, and you're kind of intimidated by the time and the length. But because it's in 4 parts, 7 hours just flies by. It's a phenomenal piece of work. Again, it's always interesting visually. If perhaps it could be a little bit tighter, but again, there's always something interesting going on screen. Again, this is not a book, but Bondarchuk wanted to at least keep the spirit of the book. And again, I haven't read the book, so I can't comment on that. But it is just a phenomenal film. Again, this is a 2K transfer. If they ever get a 4K transfer, I can't imagine how that would look, because this looks absolutely amazing. I would highly recommend the Criterion. The extras are wonderful, and it's just a total masterpiece for me. Again, it's probably went in as my second favourite epic behind The Human Condition. I love Lawrence of Arabia, but I'm well aware of the fact Lawrence of Arabia's second half could have easily probably been 40 minutes shorter. And that's not to say that this could maybe have been a little shorter, but to be honest, it flies by. Again, as gorgeous as it looks, it doesn't shy away from the bleakness and the brutality. And again, at the end of the day, we haven't learned much in the 209 years since 1812. Is that 209? We still can't get on, and was Tolstoy's point. I think. War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. And the peace to me is more the peace when you're dead rather than peace in between wars. Phenomenal film. Again, I haven't read the book. I haven't seen the King Vidor trifling 208-minute version. But I cannot wait to watch the 422-minute version again. A stunning piece of work. Pure art. Again, narrative drive, character, perhaps not the strongest you're ever going to see, but as bizarre as it sounds, they're not actually as important as just the emotional reaction you get from the images. I mean, most of the emotional reaction is just wow, and wow. So thanks very much for watching this particularly random review. I apologise for the rambling. Again, not a very analytical review, but it is one of those films that just blew me away, especially the first part. The first part, I spent most of it agog, and the last part gave me emotional wallops that you weren't really expecting, just because of the strangeness of the rest of the film. Because again, it's epic, but it doesn't lose sight of still having little quirky bits. So it's not as sterile as perhaps other epics can be. Just an amazing piece of work. How they did it is just beyond belief. And again, you maybe need to be a dictator and a bit of a psychopath to actually make a film like this, and pull it off, because it's pretty amazing. And if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. Again, it's 7 hours, but it's split into 4 parts. You can easily watch. Well, you could easily watch it in one sitting, because it does fly by. But obviously, not all of us have 7 hours to spare. I'll stop now, because otherwise I'm even rambling even more. Fantastic film, highly recommend it. But don't watch it on a black and white television. This is Saoirse Ronan from Saoirse Ronan Films, slightly exhausted, saying farewell.